You're watching National Streaming Sports. Over 20 podcasts, 70 shows, and a 3.5-star rating on Roku TV. Check out nessp.info for direct links and deals on the site Bet Us for 125% off your first three deposits in NFL and college odds for upcoming games, Major League Baseball and NBA futures, and boxing wagers. Also, check out Fanatics, sportswear for your favorite teams, and also network merchandise, retro, Northeast Streaming Sports, National Streaming Sports, Big Football, and the Mac and Jack Sports Show t-shirts. Coffee mugs are coming soon. Check it out. Yes, sir. It's Saturday. You know what that means. It's time for Sports Memories here with Mac, Jack, James, and Doc. And we're going to talk about some of the greatest events, teams, and players in sports history. And Doc's going to start us off with the great Mike Schmidt of the Philadelphia Phillies.
Wow, I always get to lead off, huh? Wow, I'm honored. All right, so this week, Mac tasked me with talking about Mike Schmidt, who is unequivocally the greatest third baseman in the history of baseball. Now, Jack said he'd like to debate this a little bit. We can do that, but let me just run down some simple statistics. When you look at WAR for a career, Mike Schmidt is first. When you look at WAR over a 7-year period, a player's 7 best years, Mike Schmidt is first. When you look at the stat they call JAWS, Mike Schmidt is first. When you look at offensive WAR, he's second. Defensive WAR, he's ninth. But he's the only guy who ranks in the top 10 in both of those areas that highly. Wins above average first, the most MVPs first, the most top 5 MVP votes first, the most 10 MVP votes first, all-time leader in home runs, fourth in RBIs, first in OPS plus, which is compared to the league and all the players around you, second all-time in slugging. Led the league in homers 7 times, led the league in ribbies 4 times, led the league in walks 3 times, led the league in slugging 5 times. People say in order to be the greatest, you have to be a world champion. Mike Schmidt was a world champion. He was the third baseman on the 1980 Phillies. He also won the MVP in the World Series that year by hitting .381. He won 3 MVPs. As I said, no other third baseman won more. He was in 12 All-Star games. He won 10 Gold Gloves. Mike Schmidt buries the competition as the greatest third baseman in the history of baseball. Now, here's an interesting stat. Last week, we were talking about OPS plus, which is how much better you are offensively than the average player. An average player would be a 100. So if you were 101, an OPS plus of 101 for a season, you were just slightly above average. Mike Schmidt's best year, his OPS plus was 198. Last week, we were talking about some players like Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays and how many times they had OPS plus seasons that high. I'm not saying Mike Schmidt was better than Willie Mays. I am not saying Mike Schmidt was better than Willie Mays. I'm not saying Mike Schmidt was better than Willie Mays. But Mike Schmidt's best season, OPS plus wise, 198. Willie Mays' best season, 185. I say that just as a comparison to say what a great offensive player Mike Schmidt actually was. When you go to the list and you look at things like WAR and JAWS and things like that, but if you look at WAR, he buries the competition. His WAR was 106.9. Call it 107. The next closest guy, Eddie Matthews, 95.9. The next closest guy, Wade Boggs, 91.4, or actually Adrian Beltre, 93.5. So those guys are more than 10 WAR, 10 wins away from Mike Schmidt. And since I'm here and talking about Mike Schmidt, I can't help but mention this guy right here, Greg Nettles. When you look at the list of the all-time greatest third baseman in baseball history, it goes like this. If we're going to list them by WAR, Schmidt, Eddie Matthews, Adrian Beltre, Wade Boggs, George Brett, Chipper Jones, Brooks Robinson, Paul Molitor, Ron Santos, Scott Rowland, Edgar Martinez, who was really just a DH, and then Greg Nettles. What's the difference between Greg Nettles and all the rest of those guys? The rest of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. Greg Nettles is the greatest third baseman in baseball history by WAR who's not in the Hall of Fame. And sometimes what happens is Schmidt was so big, George Brett was so big that greatness, we were saying this last week with Jackie Robinson, his greatness overshined. Is that a word? It was so bright that you couldn't see how great some of the other players around him, like Duke Snider, were. Brooks Robinson at the beginning of Nettles' career, and then throughout most of Nettles' career, his prime, when you have Schmidt and Brett, they obscure how great Greg Nettles was. It's time for Nettles to be in the Hall of Fame. And that's my story on Mike Schmidt.
Wait. Nettles isn't in Monument Park. Let's take it a step at a time. I mean, think of it. It's such an easy fit to get him in Monument Park. The Yankee organization just has to agree to it. The Hall of Fame becomes a little more complicated, getting votes and this and that, but not to even be in Monument Park. That's the embarrassment.
That's the embarrassment, Jack. That's the embarrassment for the Yankees. We've talked about this a lot, who have always left well-deserving players out of Monument Park. There's a slew of great Yankees who aren't there. That doesn't mean they're not Hall of Famers. Dave Winfield, who is in the Hall of Fame, is not in Monument Park.
Winfield doesn't have a Yankee legacy.
So Doc, I know we're talking about Mike Schmidt here and not everybody else, but first of all, coming from somebody who isn't a writer, it would be outshined the competition.
Yeah, I couldn't get the word outshined. What'd I say?
Overshadowed. I don't know what you were talking about.
Overshadowed. I don't know what I was.
Overshadow would have been good. Listen, about Mike Schmidt, because we're going to go down, the Yankees, and then here we go to the Yankees again. I want to talk about Mike Schmidt more than I want to the Yankees. In the 1980 World Series with the win, is that the year Pete Rose was also with him?
Yeah, they were teammates. Pete Rose played first base. Mike Schmidt played third. That was the Phillies.
Right. So
that was that famous play. There was a pop-up, and Bob Boone, the catcher, Aaron Boone's dad. Let's not talk Yankees. The ball popped out of Bob Boone's glove and into Pete Rose's glove. Remember, Pete Rose ran down and made that great catch?
Yes, I was just making sure.
Steve Carlton was the ace pitcher on that team. Tug McGraw, the former Met, was the closer. That was a fun team.
That's what I wanted to get into a little bit. The teammates of Mike Schmidt, because you can be a great Hall of Fame player and not win a World Series, and get there, and the team. Let's, for example, Ted Williams, right? The Red Sox had a very good team. They weren't a great team, but Ted Williams was a great player, and he really didn't get there. Carl Yastrzemski and them Red Sox teams. I mean, it's bad because the Yankees were so good then, and that could have went either way. But in the World Series against the Big Red Machine, hell of a World Series. Carl Yastrzemski is a legend, of course. We talked about him, but they couldn't get up past the Big Red Machine. Who did the Philadelphia Phillies play in that World Series, Doc?
The Kansas City Royals.
And how could
they beat them in 6 games? They got off to a 2-0 lead. The Royals tied it 2-up. The Phillies won the last 2. And the guy who ironically closed it out for the Phillies was Tug McGraw. Former Met, no more for being, a Met. I want to ask you one thing. Mike Schmidt,
I want to just go back to the World Series real quick. That was an interesting World Series because the Phillies were the also-rans in the National League in the late 70s. They kept losing in the National League playoffs and not making it to the World Series. They finally got over that hump and made it in 1980. The Royals were the same thing in the American League. They kept losing in the American League Championship Series, and they finally made it in 1980.
Are the Royals, did they have the players on that team that played during the Yankees the Yankees big. Well, a lot of the same Royals players there.
Yeah, George Brett, Amos Otis, Hal McRae, Frank White.
Yeah.
So that was really a really, really good team. I mean, that
was a great team. Yeah, they won the World Series just a couple of years later themselves.
Yeah, the Royals swept the Yankees in the playoffs in 1980 in 3 straight, too.
Right. So I mean, that sounds. I barely remember watching that. I forget what the heck I was doing. Maybe I was watching something else, or I was doing something else at that time. It was around the graduation. My graduation. That's how long ago this is. Jesus, we're talking. I don't believe it. But anyway, the Phillies team itself. How do you know how many Hall of Famers they have off that team?
I think the only Hall of Famer on that team is Mike Schmidt.
Joe Morgan was on that. Joe Morgan came in '83. They made the World Series in 1983, the Phillies, and they lost to Baltimore in 5 games. Yeah.
Now remember, Pete Rose, without the whole argument of the betting and all that kind. Oh, the other Hall of Famer on that team, as we mentioned before, was Steve Carlton.
Right.
So they had one pitcher, Steve Carlton, who makes the Hall of Fame. Here's their starting players. You have Boone catching, Rose at first, Manny Trio at second, Larry Bowa the shortstop, Schmidt at third, Greg Lazinski in left, Gary Maddox, who made a great catch in the World Series that at that time they compared to Willie Mays' catch, as I recall, was in center, and then Bake McBride was the right fielder. Of course, there was no DH.
And also, you can't escape the Yankees, Mac. They had the former Yankee manager, Dallas Green.
No, future Yankee manager, Dallas Green.
Future, I meant future. Oh, that's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Dallas Green became the Yankee manager at the 1989, I believe. He was the manager of the Phillies, and he was a nobody at that time. Nobody even heard of Dallas Green. He came out of nowhere.
And also, the Phillies barely got into the World Series. They were losing the decisive game 5, like 5-2 to Houston, and then they had a 5-run rally, to pull it out to get to the World Series. Mike Schmidt, defensively, I saw him play. If I had to grade him like a college student, I'd give him a B. He was a good defender, but he wasn't as good as, close to Brooks Robinson and Greg Nettles, but he was good. Okay? I give him his due. He was good, not great.
Right, but he was one of the few guys who was very good. I'll make him very good.
Okay,
one-time Gold Gloves on both sides of the ball.
I could upgrade it to very good. That's fair. Not great, though. I'm not going to say it's great like Nettles or Brooks Robinson, but that stuff what Brooks and Nettles did, they're great plays. That doesn't really show up in WAR.
That's correct. The defense.
So, and think of, what they saved on that side of the ball, But I have to agree with Mike Schmidt being the greatest third baseman in baseball history. But I thought that without looking at his stats, Eddie Matthews would be close.
Eddie Matthews is really the second best.
Right, because he combined with Hank Aaron, Eddie Matthews, one of the greatest 1-2 punches, him and Hank Aaron in baseball history. When people talk about Soto and Judge and they compare them to the great 1-2 punches, Matthews and Aaron have to come up.
That is correct. Now, interesting, you mentioned Joe Morgan. He was on that Astros team in 1980 that took the Phillies, that played the Phillies in the NLCS.
Wow. So, I mean, you're talking, the Kansas City Royals, I think you could say during the late 70s, early 80, when they played, you could say they were like the third best team in the American League. I mean, if you want to put them behind the Yankees and the Red Sox at that time, you could call them the third best team in the American League.
You might call them the second best team in the American League. They were in the ALCS year after year.
Yeah, that what hurt the Red Sox. Of course, they were in the same division as the Yankees. I think the Red Sox might have been a little better than the Royals. Maybe that's pretty close. That's a pretty close. The
Yankees during the time the Yankees played the Royals, you mentioned the value of having a great closer came into equation. I think for about the first time in that era, because even Whitey Herzog said the difference between us and the Yankees. They have a great closer that could come and close games out. Even though the Royals had Dan Quisenberry, they had
they didn't have Quisenberry in the 70s. They got him in 1980.
They got 1980. Okay.
I think 1980 was his rookie season. I'll look that up real quickly. But Quisenberry
I
wasn't
would
their
have thought he
closer.
was there in the late 70s, but I guess I'm wrong.
No, he came up in 79 and pitched in 32 games. But 1980, he pitched in 75 games, finished 68, saved 33 to lead the league. So his really first great season was 80, and then that was the year they made it to the World Series. So he said, we don't have a closer. They got a closer in Quisenberry, and then that helped get them past the Yankees. You can make that argument.
Good point. All right, Doc, as always, great job. So now we got up our youngin here. He's going to tell us a little bit, the J Train here. He's going to tell us a little bit about two-time Heisman Trophy winner Archie Griffin.
Yeah, Mac, when you gave me this topic, man, I was so excited because this is up my alley. I love football. It's one of the best subjects that I love. I like to read about, but don't get me wrong. I've been loving Carl Yastrzemski, Stan the Man. It's been great learning about those guys, man, and learn about their history in baseball. But here we are talking about football and college Heisman. Hey, you're not going to give me my one-on-one picture, man, my big picture?
Wow, look at he's already looking for that start. Go ahead, James. I'll give it to you, man.
James, get a raise too while you're at it. Make sure you know.
Appreciate
they base our pay on how many times you get in that big box. That's why he was making it small.
Okay, so
I give it a monster. Go ahead, James.
You have a bonus clause in your contract, James.
There's a great history of Heisman Trophy winners. I mean, it's comprised of running backs, quarterbacks. Now it's a quarterback league now. It's a quarterback trophy. And wide receivers. But we can look back and talk about some of the greatest running backs that have won the award. We're looking all the way back to Doak Walker, Billy Cannon. Those guys were great back in their day. We're also looking at Tony Dorsett, Earl Campbell. The list goes on. Barry Sanders, all the way up to Derrick Henry and Mark Ingram. But all those guys have one thing in common, that the one guy I'm about to talk about right now, they don't have anything that they won a Heisman Trophy, but he stands alone because he won two back-to-back in 1974 and in 1975. Back then, there was no other player to do that then, and there's been no player since to do that now. And let's start talking about Archie Griffin, a 5'8", 180-pound guy that I was very surprised to see that he was that size and have the statistical data that's listed on him to play for Ohio State. He was born in Columbus, Ohio, one of 8 children. And he played for Eastmore High School, where he starred his junior and senior year. His senior year, he created records, and I think he rushed for 1,787 yards and 29 touchdowns. And that's where he got noticed by the great Woody Hayes, coach of Ohio State, that had won 5 national championships up to that point. And he recruited him and brought him in. And he became the starter his freshman year. It was a starter. He didn't really get noticed until one game against North Carolina, when he broke the single game rushing record for 239 yards. And then he ended up finishing with 867 rushing yards. And they got to the Rose Bowl that year. And that's one of 4 Rose Bowls that he got to. And that's a record for him that's tied with only one other player starting in the Rose Bowl, and that's with USC's Brian Cushing. His sophomore season was even better. He said one thing. He said, Coach Woody Hayes says, if you're not getting better, you're getting worse. You never stay the same. So it was in his mindset. Mind you, this is a very humble guy that's loved off the field, but in his mindset, Archie Griffin's mindset was to always get better. So he worked hard. And they changed the running back set. They changed the offensive set from T set to I formation. And that's when Pete Johnson came in. Pete Johnson was his lead fullback. And I'll talk about him a little later. Archie Griffin nearly doubled his rushing statistics. And he had 1,428 yards, and they went to another Rose Bowl, as I said before. And they went undefeated, 10-0 and 1. They tied one game with Michigan, I believe, that year. And Jack, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think they tied Michigan, and they didn't get the number one. But next year was even better. His junior year was the year that he won his Heisman, and he got 1,620 yards. And they also went to the Rose Bowl again that year, but they finished 9-2. They didn't do so well. But his senior season is the one that he really regrets not winning a championship, because they did not, unfortunately, but they went undefeated. And for most of the year, they were ranked number one. Most of the year, they were ranked number one. And he said, again, if you're not getting better, you're getting worse. And he wanted to get better. He wanted to be the first player ever to get 2 Heisman back-to-back. And he said he respects that year more so because he earned every single yard of that 1,357 yards that he received, because everybody knew he was the Heisman Trophy winner, and they were coming at him. They were giving him their best. And he said he earned every single yard, but they got to the Rose Bowl. They got to the Rose Bowl and lost to the same team that they beat that year by 3 touchdowns, UCLA, in a close 18-16, stunning and terrible loss for them. And he said that it still to this day haunts him, because, again, that was the last time that Woody Hayes would get to the Rose Bowl, and that would end his career. But what a storied career at Ohio State, because he ended up at the time with the most rushing yards of any running back in the league ever in history, with about 5,589 yards. And I was surprised to see that he only had 26 touchdowns. But man, when I watched some of his highlights, he was just that I formation for them was great. And I would see his style was a little different. He wasn't the fastest guy. He was fast, but he wasn't the fastest guy. But he had power for his size, a subtle power that he could bounce off a guy, and had a nice jump cut and a nice spin move that would give him like extra yardage against some of those defenders. And I really like the style of running back, that kind of style, especially someone that size. I was just surprised to see how good he was. And he ended up with a host of records. Like I said, 2-time 1974, 1975 Heisman Trophy winner. He also had 2-time conference championship MVP. And he had he shares a record with Jonathan Taylor, leading the Big Ten in rushing 3 years in a row. There was never any other player. And to win a Heisman, the last player to win a Heisman for Ohio State was Hopalong Cassidy. It was Howard Hopalong Cassidy in 1955. So 19 years later, that's the name. When I saw that, it just had me cracking up. But yeah, it was just incredible to see his story and how much of a humble guy off the field that he was. But I'm sorry, Maxwell won the Maxwell Award. He also won the Walter Camp Award twice, Player of the Year, and he has a host of other awards that I really can't name. UPI Player of the Year. But what's even great is that the Rose Bowl, they built a statue for him and a tribute walk for him. And his 45s were retired, and he's in the College Football Hall of Fame, and he went to Ohio State's Hall of Fame as well. What a great player, man. He eventually got drafted. And he went to the Cincinnati Bengals, but it wasn't really a great career there. He played with the likes of greats like Anthony Munoz, Cincinnati great, Chris Collinsworth, and they all stated that had he been on better teams with them, he might have had a better chance. Even the fullback, Pete Johnson, that got drafted a year after him, had a better career there with Cincinnati Bengals than he did. But ultimately, his legacy lies within being a great player at Ohio State. And one thing I wanted to say, his coach said about him, he's a better man than he is a football player, and he's the best football player that he's ever seen.
Yeah, sometimes that's hard to figure out how a player could be an absolute superstar in college and be more than and just be decent in the NFL. Like you take Reggie Bush, great run at USC, and he was a good player in the NFL, had a good career, but he should have been a superstar based on what he did, in college. Coming to the NFL, had been better than he was, even though he had a good career. Same with Archie Griffin. I mean, he was okay, but he expected something a little more. Especially, and it was odd that Hopalong Cassidy, who played for Ohio State, played for Woody Hayes, I believe. They asked Woody Hayes who was better, and he said Archie Griffin was a lot better than Hopalong Cassidy. You normally don't pick one player against another who you may have coached, but yeah, I mean those 3 years in college are great, but sometimes I don't understand the NFL. If you do it in college, you should be able to do the NFL. I know I understand that players are quicker, they're stronger, they're this, they're that, but you're playing against the same guys in college.
I have to tweak Mac here because Mac gets upset if we make this go to the Yankees. But I can't help it. I just checked my facts. Hopalong Cassidy was a Yankee scout and a Yankee minor league coach. Just had to throw that in there.
George Steinbrenner, I guess, knew him when George coached in college.
Mm-hmm. So when you said Hopalong Cassidy, I said, well, I think he was a Yankee scout.
Hopalong Cassidy, yes. Look, John Elway was in Yankees.
Jack with Jackson in there that he doesn't understand. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of examples of great college players that don't make it in the NFL, like Tim Tebow. First one that comes to mind, one of the greatest college players of all time. Didn't really pan out in the NFL. Even Herschel Walker was kind of underwhelming.
Herschel Walker was pretty good.
Underwhelming from college to pro. I would say,
yeah, you can make okay.
You know what I mean? He played well, played good. I agree with that, but compared to his college career, not even close. I think we don't talk. When we talk about the greatest college players of all time, Archie Griffin gets forgotten. Here's another one that gets forgotten, 2-time Heisman Trophy winner. First thing that comes to mind, Tim Tebow. Again, Herschel Walker. All these other players come before Archie Griffin, who was the only one that won 2 Heisman Trophy winners. So, I mean, this guy gets, again, another player that because of the age and because of the time and whatever, he gets lost.
ESPN did recognize him in 2020. They did the top 150 greatest college football players of all time, and he's number 4. So that speaks volume.
Yeah, ESPN might, but if you listen to anybody on talk shows right now talking about it, and of course that's 2020. It's what now, James? 2024, right? So anyway, it's almost a quarter of a century. Okay, James. Let's
no, half a century.
Yeah, let's do the addition correctly here. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about was him as a pro. And as a pro, he did have one good year where I think he rushed for 688 yards. He had a 4.9 carry, which is a very good percentage per rush. When you get into the NFL back then, when he came in, he wasn't the prototype. You had the big bruising running backs that also had speed. Archie Griffin probably would be better in today's game because he had good hands. If he was used like, say, a David Meggett was used for the Giants, which was one of the running backs that was kind of different compared to the other ones, he probably would be better in today's NFL than he was back then because he was a lot lighter. And I guess when his one Super Bowl appearance, he only got one attempt rushing, and he muffed the kickoff, which they pulled him out. I mean, you muff a kickoff and help lose the game in the Super Bowl, you're all done, dude. I mean, and that kind of hurt him. But again, for that time with the running games in the NFL back then, that was the main reason. That was you had a great running back. You won the Super Bowl, or you were at least in contention, and it was just I don't think it was the right time for Archie Griffin to be in the NFL at that time, honestly. So
I don't know. Also, there's this little element. He played for the Cincinnati Bengals, Ohio's team, coming from Ohio State. Maybe that wasn't the best fit for him to be, stay in that hometown where he was revered as a legend, because anything he'd do with the Bengals, short of being sensational, would be viewed as a little bit maybe of a disappointment. So you don't know how that could have affected him mentally. Had he gone to another smaller city like Buffalo or Green Bay or something, the expectations may have been slightly less because he wasn't the hometown hero elsewhere. He wouldn't have been.
Great point. That's a great point. Sort of like Kenny Pickett's, right? Yeah. I mean, he was
Pittsburgh,
yeah. So maybe I didn't even think of that. That's a great point. Good job, James. Now we got my co-host forever and the boxing expert of all boxing experts, Jack Hirsch, going to tell us a little bit about Smoking Joe Frazier. We've talked about it before, but not in this format. So that's why I went ahead and wanted to do this on Smoke.
Yeah, Smoking Joe Frazier was born in Beaufort, South Carolina. He wound up in Philadelphia, got married very young when he was like 16. That's not advisable, They get married way that young. But he went to work in a slaughterhouse, to provide for his family a job. And there's a story behind that for those who saw the movie Rocky, which I know is Doc's favorite movie. When you see Rocky pounding on the meat at the slaughterhouse, that's a takeoff of Joe Frazier. Sylvester Stallone had reached out to Joe Frazier about his life, his career, and Joe Frazier told him about the time he worked, in the slaughterhouse there. And you see Rocky pounding the meat, and later, of course, Joe Frazier would have a cameo in that movie, as Apollo Creed's nemesis, a brief cameo, and of course, Apollo Creed was a takeoff of Muhammad Ali. But Joe Frazier, then he went to a gym in Philadelphia to lose weight. So he'd be punching the heavy bag one day just to lose weight. He had no thought of being a boxer. And a trainer in Philadelphia, Yank Durham, noticed Frazier hitting the bag. He liked the way he looked. He convinced him to come back to take up boxing. He trained Frazier. Frazier had a good knack for it. And he actually wound up in the Olympic trials against a fighter named Buster Mathis, and best 2 out of 3 wins would determine which heavyweight would represent the United States in the Olympics. Mathis won both fights by decision, but as fate would have it, Mathis injured his thumb in training, and Frazier, as the alternate, would then take Mathis's spot on the 1964 United States Olympic boxing team that went to Tokyo. And he won the gold medal, Frazier, even though he didn't have an amateur style of jab and move and be elusive. He was good enough to win the gold medal. Then he turned pro. There was this group called Cloverleaf. They all got together and they invested in Frazier like they'd invest in stocks. So this way Frazier could have a salary where he could train, where he could quit his job at the slaughterhouse and only concentrate on boxing. And he worked his way up the ladder. Eddie Futch came on as an assistant trainer, legendary trainer Eddie Futch assisted Yank Durham. And they beat the right opponents on the way up, like Eddie Machin, George Chuvalo, Oscar Bonavina. And then in 1967, Muhammad Ali was stripped of the title for for not taking induction into the United States service. And Frazier won the vacant New York State title and a few other states in 1968 by having a rematch with his nemesis Buster Mathis, who he knocked out in 11 rounds. And Ali was in exile for over 3 years. And ultimately, Frazier would square off against Jimmy Ellis in 1970. Jimmy Ellis was the WBA heavyweight champion. He won it in a tournament of the best 9 fighters in the world. I say best 9, not 8, because Frazier declined going into the tournament. His management didn't want him to take part in the tournament. Maybe because they thought it was risky, they didn't want to take a chance or whatever, and they went their own way, Frazier. So Frazier eventually fights Jimmy Ellis on February 16th, 1970 at Madison Square Garden. He knocks Ellis out in 4 rounds. And Ali gets his license before the year's over, and Ali's talking, bad-mouthing Frazier, that he's an imitation champion. He's this. Ali, there's a big Ali faction out there. Ali, and then Frazier eventually gets to fight Ali in the fight of the century, March 8th, 1971. One of the great days of my life. I sat in the last row, got a ticket, to see that fight. It was incredible how I got the seat mailing cash in the mail. I found out later from someone who was in charge of dispersing the tickets, there were few seats left in the garden, single seat. So only the people who applied for one ticket, for somehow thrown in the pool, and as fate would have it, there I was, last row seat. Never experienced anything like that. And to show you how big that was, 50 years to the day after the biggest sporting event in boxing history. You can't make this stuff up. I had a grandson born 50 years to the day. I called him the 50th anniversary kid. That's his nickname growing up. So he's always going to take an interest in Ali Frazier. 50 years to the day, this is like insane. And Frazier hated Ali's guts. Ali ramped himself up. We probably disliked Frazier to a degree in 1971, but later Ali would soften towards Frazier. But Frazier always hated Ali. I mean, how can you not dislike a guy who's always calling you sellout and Uncle Tom, you're ugly, you go, duh, 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 duh. Ali would really lay it on thick to Frazier, but it was Ali being Ali, it's unforgivable. Later, Ali would have a lot of remorse because he really did like Frazier. He just got a little too carried away. And then when Frazier beat Ali in the fight of the century, and it was the most superhuman effort you're ever going to see. I mean, the way Frazier put out, he knocked Ali down in the 15th round. Of course, afterwards, Ali would claim he won the fight, and people believed, a lot of people would believe Ali no matter what. They would buy into his thing. But believe me, Ali didn't win the fight. Frazier legitimately won it. Frazier was never quite the same after winning the fight of the century because he's put so much into it. And there was such a letdown after, but he did fight Ali a couple of more times, lost a close decision in the rematch 3 years later. Then they had the Thrilla in Manila, one of the great heavyweight fights of all time. It was brutally hot. If it wasn't that hot, I believe it would have gone the extra round, but Ali outlasted Frazier, and it was stopped at the end of the 14th round. And Ali always wanted to let bygones be bygones, but Frazier kind of wouldn't let go of his hatred towards Ali until the end of their lives. Frazier got together with Ali, sat down, broke bread. So before Frazier passed away, he did make peace with Ali. I'm sure he still had some hard feelings, but Frazier's nemesis, I guess, was George Foreman. Foreman knocked Frazier out in 2 rounds, 2 years after Frazier beat Ali. Frazier wasn't the same fight at that point. He was still excellent, but he wasn't the same super great fighter. He kind of lost his edge, but he probably never beats Foreman anyway, because I had the chance to spend some time with Frazier, long after he was retired, and I asked him point blank the question, the you that beat Ali on March 8, 1971, if that you had fought Foreman instead of the you that fought him later on, do you think you would have beaten him? And at first he didn't answer. I asked the second time, and then he said, I don't think it would have made any difference. I said, was it a question of styles? He said, that's exactly it. He thought that George maybe just had his number, style-wise. But great guy, Joe Frazier. I interviewed him in 1996 in the News One studio. And I liked the guy. The guy had me in a headlock before the interview was over, kidding around. That's, and I felt like hanging out with the guy after. Just a great guy to be around.
Jack, I think that people, today, we get the pay-per-views, we get the big shows, we got YouTube involved. They don't realize how big an event this was. There was a concert scheduled for that night, a James Taylor concert that they had to reschedule. They gave James Taylor and his group free tickets to go to the thing. But this was a who's who of everyone at that fight of the century. Frank Sinatra, all the I think Dionne Warwick was there, if I'm not mistaken. There was so many great personalities, celebrities there. This was really the first beginning of boxing to me to become more than boxing, to become an event, to become a show.
How big it was, okay? And Doc, you're not going to comprehend this fully when I say this. If you were around then and the Yankees are playing the 7th game of the World Series the same night as the Ali Frazier fight was going on, and you could have had a ticket for both, you would be so torn up which one to go to. That'll give you an idea. If the Yankees win the 7th game of the World Series, and you being the Yankee fan, you are, of course, I could get a seat right on top of the dugout, a ringside seat to Ali Frazier. Okay, you would. It would be a tough decision for even you. That's how big it was. Okay,
it was huge.
It was off the greatest sporting event in history. I mean, nothing is compared to it. I mean, nothing at all.
And Jack, that was on closed circuit, so you couldn't see it live unless you were at the. Of course, you were at the fight.
Yeah, everything was closed circuit then. You didn't have pay-per-view. People flocked to movie theaters. And their factions were split because even though Ali was not a war activist, an anti-war activist at all, Ali refused induction in because he didn't want to go. He never went out and marched and joined protests against the war. Not at all. But the anti-war activists backed Ali as if he was taking a stand against the war. And the hard hats, who were for the war, this and that, they backed Frazier. And Frazier never took a stand for the war either. But they made these guys into political symbols, which neither guy was making himself. So the factions were kind of torn. There was like a lot of division going on. And Ali did use the racial angle as well, saying any black man who supports Frazier, you know what I mean, is an Uncle Tom or this and that. You can understand Frazier's bitterness, like him calling Frazier the white man's champion.
The funny part about that was Joe Frazier is actually like a son or grandson of a cotton plantation slave worker, where Ali was a middle class black guy who really didn't experience the black life that Joe Frazier experienced, which was unbelievable to me that came about being that way. One last question for you. If Frazier retires, 1971 is after the Ali fight, and he would be like, I don't know, what, 33-0 or 30?
He would have been 27-0, 22 stoppages, something. But he couldn't have retired after that fight so easily because he put so much into beating Ali, and he was so exhausted. He went to the hospital after, where he spent like 10 days because his blood pressure soared to the point where he nearly died. Okay. Right. And Ali was making it out like he beat Frazier up so bad that, Frazier had to go to the hospital. He couldn't fight again, this and that. But never mind, in the 15th round, it was Frazier who knocked Ali down, who had the big round at the end of the fight. So if he beat him up so bad, why was Frazier the one, with the biggest threat?
If he didn't listen to Ali and everybody else, now he would have been, like you said, 27-0. How do we think of Joe Frazier as compared as we do today?
I don't think he would have rated any higher, believe it or not. He would have been unbeaten. Would it have been I think it may have been a little stigma on Ali's legacy, because Ali wouldn't have had the chance to avenge that defeat later on. You'd look, well, he didn't beat Joe Frazier. So those who are saying that Ali's not the greatest heavyweight of all time could point to something like that. Well, he lost to Joe Frazier. But think of this, guys. Joe Frazier won the biggest sporting event in history. He was the winner of the biggest sporting event in history, and that's kind of his legacy there. I mean, so yeah, I mean, great fighter, great guy, and imagine Ali's thought when Ali saw Rocky for the first time. He didn't know Joe Frazier had a cameo, and Ali loved the Rocky movie, they said. And then when he saw Frazier come in the ring, he was going crazy with joy because Ali looked at himself, I'm Apollo Creed, and there's Joe Frazier. And he is saying, you've been ducking me for a long time. And he's going, you're next, Joe, you're next. I mean, so Ali loved that scene, absolutely loved it.
A great job as always, Jack, on box. I got something to talk to you guys about, and it is a team, and I don't know, besides maybe Lawrence Taylor or maybe Deacon Jones, a team that is really represented by a defensive lineman. When you think of the Pittsburgh Steelers, you do think of Terry Bradshaw. You think of Jack Lampert. You think of Lynn Swann and Stallworth and even Franco Harris. But the biggest character is Mean Joe Green, right? I mean, he's in the commercials. He was a dominant defensive tackle at that time. And, I mean, it's unbelievable when you go back and you think of a team that you actually think of a defensive lineman, maybe before even some of the key skill position players. The Steelers of the 1970s were unbelievable. I mean, they were, again, during a time where the AFC dominated the NFC when it came to Super Bowls for the most part. The Steelers, in their first year, of course, they had a losing record. They were 1-13 and 69. They select Terry Bradshaw, Mel Blount that year. They end up getting Jack Ham and Franco Harris in 1972. And with that, they end up winning the first division title, beating the Raiders, 13-7. That was part of the Immaculate Reception, the famous ball that was knocked in the air to Franco Harris, who wasn't even out in a pass pattern. He was just kind of standing out there watching to see what happened with the play. And there's the ball. He runs, he catches the ball, and he ends up scoring a touchdown. They ended up losing to the Miami Dolphins in the championship, who went on to win the Super Bowl that following game. But the Steelers bounced back. In 1974, they win their first 6 AFC Central titles. Buffalo and Oakland were the two teams they went through to get to the Super Bowl, winning their first Super Bowl against the Minnesota Vikings. The Purple People Eaters with Fran Tarkenton 16-6. Fran Tarkenton didn't stand a chance against that front four of the Steel Curtain. They were all over in that game. They couldn't run the ball. The Purple People Eaters played well, but Pittsburgh gets his first Super Bowl. They end up going back in 1975. They win their first 11 games, finished with a 12-2 record. They defeat the Colts and then beat the Raiders in a nail-biter, winning 21-17. They go and they play the Dallas Cowboys in their first memorable Super Bowl of all time. They beat them 21-17. Let me make sure I got it right. Yes, 21-17. A great Super Bowl, and they become winning a Super Bowl back-to-back. They become one of those teams that end up doing that. In 1978, the Steelers again go to the Super Bowl and again play the Dallas Cowboys. And they win that one 35-31. Now, I want to stop right there, guys, and talk a little bit about those two games, especially that 35-31 game. Dallas had an unbelievable team at that time. And it was either them or the Vikings, and Dallas normally ended up beating the Vikings maybe one or two more than they beat them. The Rams was kind of in third there. But what a team the Dallas Cowboys had. They had Roger Staubach and Tony Dorsett, Too Tall Jones, Randy White, in the first Super Bowl, Bob Lilly. They had tremendous players on that team. And, of course, Tom Landry versus Chuck Noll. And Chuck Noll, again, he ended up winning another Super Bowl down the line, beating the Rams, 79 season, 80 Super Bowl. Chuck Noll goes 4-0 in Super Bowls as a head coach. And when we start talking about the greatest head coaches of all time, and here we go. Vince Lombardi, maybe even Bill Parcells gets a little more shine than Chuck Noll, Tom Landry, Don Shula, and here's one of the greatest defensive coaches maybe in the history of football, next to Tom Landry and Don Shula. That's what they were back then. Goes 4-0. And we really don't talk about him, which is crazy to me, Jack. I mean, how can you?
Joe Gibbs, too, we don't talk about. But in all fact, Chuck, no, I agree. You go 4-0 in Super Bowls, win 4 in 6 years. But he had a chance to draft Dan Marino and just whiffed on it with a late first round pick, But it's what is. But you're right. That Dallas Super Bowl game, they beat Dallas 35-31. It was a close game, but they were up 35-17, and Dallas got 2 late touchdowns to make it look good. And Dallas failed to convert an onside kick at the end. Otherwise, it would have gotten really interesting. Those Steelers teams, arguably the greatest NFL teams of all time. Arguably, you could put them in the discussion,
Definitely could. Was the first team to win 4 Super Bowls, and I think it was finally broken by the 49ers, who ended up winning 4 Super Bowls, and then after that, of course, the Cowboys ended up winning 5.
4 in 6 years, and they basically had the same team the whole 6 years, the same impact players. Could you imagine they filled in the gaps the 2 years they didn't win it when they won 2? Didn't win 2 years and then won 2 years. Imagine had they won 6 years in a row in football. That would have been like the greatest dynasty of all time. Had they, because football is so harder to win, I think, a championship than in the NBA. I don't want to say baseball because we're living in a different era now, so it's hard to win one in baseball. But had they won 6 years in a row, that would have been off the charts.
How many Hall of Famers on that team? I mean, 2 hands, right? You can count on 2 hands how many Hall of Famers on that team.
I mean, to me, I don't have that in front of me, but I mean, if you're talking, you're talking Mean Joe Green, you're talking L.C. Greenwood, you're talking Jack Lambert, you're talking Mel Blount, you're talking Jack Ham. I mean, and that's just on the defensive side of it. I think everybody on that line.
Juan, Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'm missing someone. We've got up to 8 right now off the top of our head. Hall of Famers.
Yes. I mean, incredible team. And the 2 games they lost, both those teams won the Super Bowl. I mean, you lost to the great and Miami. Really, that was probably their best win of that whole season. They really they put the smackdown on Pittsburgh that year. Oakland, last minute. Oakland ends up beating the Pittsburgh Steelers. Both those teams won the Super Bowl, and that's how good this team was. And to turn a program around like he did, to put the right players in the right. And remember, back then, Chuck Noll had a lot to say on who the draft was too. You had Art Rooney. Of course, that was his first Super Bowl ever in Pittsburgh's history, and Pittsburgh had a long history. But he had a lot to do with selecting the players. As Jack said, he whiffed on Dan Marino, but I think even every great GM whiffs at least on one great player, right? So, but I mean, what a career! And as you know, the Pittsburgh Steelers, well, they got as far as coaches, I think they're on their 4th in the whole damn history of Pittsburgh.
Sometimes coaches and managers slip under the radar. Like in baseball, there's Bruce Bochy. He's won 3 World Series, right, with the Giants. And no one talks about him as one of the great managers, and I don't think they're going to do it into the future. But we talk about guys who maybe won 1 World Series in their careers being brilliant geniuses and so on. And But Chuck Noll 4 Super Bowls, but we talk about Bill Walsh as a genius.
Right.
Like we should. But somehow Chuck Noll, maybe he just wasn't charismatic and didn't interview well. I don't know.
I know that he was pretty intense with his players. I know he's pretty intense on the sidelines. I'm trying to remember. I think he I think he almost got in a fight with one of the head coaches at midfield. I mean, for something that ended up happening. It was very intense.
No. Well, let's make a comparison. Bud Grant was the Viking coach. He took them to 4 Super Bowls. They lost all 4. And Bud Grant's name comes up maybe a little more than Chuck Noll's, perhaps.
It's true.
Think of that.
It's true.
I want you guys. I got a thought here for you, because there is this common thought that it's hard to win multiple Super Bowls. But I'm just looking through the list of Super Bowl champions. I just got this thought in my head. I think that's incorrect. I think in football you have teams dominate more than any other sport. Right now you got the Chiefs in the Super Bowl 4 out of 5 years. Before that, the Patriots were in the Super Bowl like a million out of a million years. You had the Broncos dominate for a number of years. Before, they had the Cowboys dominating for a couple of years. Then you had the 49ers dominating for a number of years. The Steelers had a dominating period. The Packers had a dominating period. I think in football, you actually have dynasties that come. You become great in football, and it sort of can last for a long time. It lasts for a longer time than it does in other sports.
You got a point. Maybe I'm thinking of the Chicago Bulls in the NBA, 6 titles with Jordan, the Warriors 4 with Steph Curry. But your point is well taken.
Yes, I mean,
yeah,
and I agree with you, Doc. The thing is, to have 4 Super Bowls in 6 years is a little bit. That's a little bit.
That's impressive.
Yes, I mean, if you're going to go back in the history of the Super Bowl since 1969-70 to 2024, there aren't that many teams that have 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. As you now, the Patriots.
If the Chiefs make it this year,
right,
that'll be 4 Super Bowls in 6 years.
Ahead of the Steelers, Doc. You want to know why? Because they would have had 4 in 6 years. But they would have went to another one that they lost, so they would have been in 5, and the Steelers were in a total of 4. So they'd actually exceed the Steelers.
If the Chiefs do it this year, it'll be 4 in 6 years.
And Doc, you just named a total contrast, because you go back then in the 70s, it was extremely defensive dominated. Now is more offensive dominated, and the game is a little bit changed for the offense to succeed more as well.
That's
100%.
a bunch of that is very. That is very iffy what you're saying there, because the teams that win the Super Bowl, and that's even with Tampa Bay and KC last year, their defense and running game was a big reason why they won them Super Bowls. So maybe during the regular season you're right, but when it gets to the crunch time, the defense and running game is a big deal. In fact, I've got some story to talk to you about on tomorrow, the great segue, big football show, how the running game in the NFL is soaring compared to the way it was last year and the year before that. And we'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit. Folks, thanks for joining us today on the Sports Memory Show. This is one of the funnest shows that I do during the week. It's informative and fun, which is excellent. Everyone here does a great job at their topics, and we kind of compare things and analyze things. We don't just talk about what happened. So thanks for joining us today. You have, I think it's Keith Angle up on us on Roku right after us here today. Doc, of course, was before us. Don't forget about the Dr. Sem Show every Saturday at 7 a.m. And be sure to join us some more on the Big Football Show. Again, thank you for tuning in. Have a great Saturday. And please stay out of trouble when you're out there today. Have a good one.